happened when it happened. Instead, you look at it as, oh, I'm going to go in and discover what's going to happen. So we're now having all these college kids and high school kids go in and try to decide what happened in history. Now, they weren't there 200 years ago. So what are they using as their materials to discover? Well, of course, as we've just heard Huxley said, when you don't give them certain pieces of information, it's a lot easier than having to refute all this information. So what we're doing now is we're giving little smidgens of pieces of information. Let me give you an example. Third grade social studies book teaches kids starting, well, they have different chapters, and it's done by regions in the United States. So you go and you look at the Northeast, and in the Northeast they're going to talk about maybe the Pilgrims, and then a couple of paragraphs later they're going to talk about John F. Kennedy, and maybe a couple of paragraphs later they're going to talk about a baseball team. They jump all through time. There's no chronological order of anything. And it's all little stories here, and this, and this, and this, and this. Then you go do this in the South, in the Southeast, and in the Midwest. And you jump around the United States, and all you've done is had these little pieces of information out of context, out of sequence, out of chronology. So that the child, when he, Randy said, how many people now know how many Supreme Court justices there are, who they are, or just basic facts about our country. They don't learn those things anymore. So that's missing in this whole picture. I call it fractured learning, because what it's done is it's given them just a little smidgen of this, smidgen of that, and then let's go to the math. And again, I know all of you have seen some of the illustrations, and we open our book actually with a picture of one of the mathematical problems. Instead of learning in third grade how you have long multiplication, you go and memorize this thing. You learn these different varieties of ways that you can refigure it. Like Karen mentioned, what is 5 times 3? It's 15. But if you did it in 3s, you got it, and if you got it in 5s, you didn't. The point being that we're not training the kids with the facts to build the base of knowledge. Now, this is important in mathematics, because mathematics is more than just knowing what addition, subtraction, algebra, geometry, and so forth is. It's a way of training the brain. You look at it this way. The brain research shows that when you are learning mathematical facts, you're kind of doing these little gouges of ridges in your brain, of what I call knowledge pathways. And as you go through life, those knowledge pathways deepen, and you deepen that knowledge base. So what you're doing is you're laying down a permanent way of thinking that is logical, analytical, and basically common sense. When you don't teach mathematics that way, you have skipped that. So therefore, our children are not learning to have these thinking patterns in their brains. Then we go to the social studies that I gave you, and we're not giving them any historical context, any kind of sequence, any kind of chronology, so they can't add the dots together. And then those of you, because I think most of you are probably involved somehow in your area of civically Republican-wise or whatever, then you say, why can't they figure it out? Well, duh, they can't figure it out because they haven't been taught. The brain has not been trained to lay down that knowledge base. So consequently, what we're doing is not only with Common Core being the latest wrinkle in this whole thing, but we are destroying the ability of our children to think analytically, to analyze, to be discerning, and then without a moral base, they don't have a base to discern on. And therefore, you go through this whole process, and it's going on across the country. Karen has talked a lot about where we are on some of these things in the federal level, at the state level. When I was down at the State House a couple weeks ago, Missouri also said, oh, we're going to get rid of Common Core. And so we had bought into it like every other state. We had signed a contract for money for something we didn't know. Now, that's not financial responsibility to start with. But we signed a blank check, and when we saw what the check was, of course, all the bureaucrats loved it, but then the parents started seeing what was going on and said, no way, we're going to stop this. So our legislature passed a bill, but there was great resistance. Karen has referred to the Bush Foundation, the Gates Foundation. We had huge amounts of monies, just like you all have had. The grassroots is out there spending their own dime, and these elites that are aligned with Pearson, with Smarter Balance, with PARC, with all the testing associations, they have a lot of vested interest in this, and they're not going to lose it. So they're down there fighting you. Well, this is very interesting, and it's just now coming out in the state of Missouri. At that same state board meeting, they had appointed panels of teachers and educators and some parents to revisit the standards. And they did it in 6 different areas, in English, literature, and science, mathematics, and so forth. And what came out of this whole thing was, it was basically just a rehash of Common Core. And how did this happen? Because we actually had on those panels, almost all of them had at least one parent on there who was concerned and was upset with what was happening. What they discovered with the Freedom of Information Act is that there was great collusion going on behind the scenes with our state board, our state Department of Education, and the big funders were sending in money. They set it up so they had what they called facilitators. I know you all know what that word means. A facilitator who was going to direct this whole process. And if you weren't really astute as to how they do these things, you're sucked into it and you go along. We had one mother who had been part of this, who testified, and she was furious. She said, I have been used. I can't tell you how much time I put in on this. And I'm down here to tell you that what we were given, we were forbidden to look at Massachusetts standards. We were forbidden to do these other things. We were not allowed to do this. We were told we could only do this. Now this is supposedly the people's legislature who came forth and said we have to do this. So there's great efforts to keep the money in the pockets of these people and the power in the hands of these people who are most anxious down the road to be able to control the future. Now, are all these people bad? No. I would say most of them are just very good people trying to do a good job. They really are. But there's just enough in there of these people, and this is why you need to know the history. You need to know who the players are, and we go into greater depth on that. We go back into the 90s, into Achieve, and to the chief state school officers and IBM and all of the players there in the school to work. Businessmen have bought into this because they think it's going to provide for them the worker force. You know, there's another issue that's surfacing right now, and Lori and my husband talked about this last night. I won't spend but a minute or so on it, but it's the issue of the refugee resettlement program coming into this area and to our state of Missouri. And if you listen carefully what the Chancellor of Germany said, Merkel, she said, we need labor. We've aborted generations of kids. We're not replacing our own population. And the business community needs labor, and they need cheap labor. So that's where you get your visas and your refugee resettlements and all these people coming in. What they're not looking at is that you cannot have immigration without assimilation. Because if you don't have assimilation, it's invasion. Mm-hmm. And so we have two things happening now in our country, and they're all coming together. So if you get these people coming into our country, are they going to be assimilated? No. They're going to be given those 36 pages of how wonderful Islam is and nothing about Christianity. They won't learn the Constitution. They'll read Howard Zinn's history book, and they're going to hate America. So we are in a place where, you know, it doesn't matter whether you've got kids or grandkids. This is your future of freedom. And so I would leave you with this. We've put this book together for one reason, and that is to provide a tool. And I think that it is probably the most exciting time in our history. I've been involved in this almost all my life. And I'm now saying